It was the hour the town calls glass blue, when the sea holds its breath and the gulls forget their arguments. In my workshop, steam curled from a copper pot where brine, rosemary, and a slow ribbon of olive oil learned each other's names. The window was cracked. The tide charts fluttered on the nail. Low tide would peak at 7:42 p.m., the line I'd draw in my ledger with a stub of blue pencil. I make soap the way my grandmother made apologies, gently, with both hands, and never in public. People come to my door in winter with cold fingers and cracked stories. A fisherman who lost a brother. A bartender who keeps a small jar of salt scrub beside her till they say my bars sleep like stones in the palm. I tell them it's just lie and patience. But the truth is I write to the sea every day, and the sea writes back. It leaves salt on the ropes and a thin shine on the steps and sometimes a shell like a closed eye. I leave letters for it in return and grocery receipts. On the backs of tide tables, in the margins of the weather page. My handwriting is a tide of its own, neat when the moon is shy, looser when it fattens. Ash came late, his boots soft with sand. The doorbell is an old brass bell from a dinghy, and it chimed like a throat being cleared. I didn't turn right away. The temperature was at trace and I wanted the mixture to cool. When I did look up, he was there with his hard hat under his arm, and the kind of smile that lands and then walks back out again. Harbor meeting ran long. He set the hat beside the packaged orders. We're shoring the East Pier before the storm cycle. The cranes won't behave. You talk like they choose to, I said, and shut the burner. They're cranes, not men. He stepped closer and kissed the place where soap flecks had dried on my cheekbone. You smell like the sea when it's being kind. The sea is rarely kind, I said, though I knew what he meant. Rosemary lemon, the faint metal of salt. He leaned against the counter and read the order labels, the ones I tied with twine. Mrs. Hera lavender brine. Dylan scented salt bar. My ledger lay open. Tonight's line pinned between a grocery list and a sketch of the bay. In the margin I had written, low tide will tell the truth if you're quiet enough. Truth, he asked, tapping the words. What did it tell you today? That the gull who sits on the red buoy is a bully. That the tide is hiding its hurt. That you forgot the mug you like at my place because you left in a hurry. His hand paused. Quinlan, he said, using the small name the town favors, then correcting to the name I keep for myself. I was going to text. Texting is for the things that don't matter, I said, but I smiled to make it softer. He hates when I make a poem out of a bruise. He glanced at the wall clock I rescued from a shuttered ferry office. Its second hand a thin anchor. I can't stay long. There's another briefing. On a Friday, on an ocean. We were like that. Me with my bent pencil and my pots. Him with rope burns and a map in his head. Both of us living by schedules the moon approved or refused. When we moved in together, his kettle beside my jars, my sea glass in his dish, it felt like we'd drawn two harbors on the same chart. Still, sometimes the piers didn't meet. Marina called, he said, not looking at me, which is how Ash says the delicate things. Her research vessel is making port for the winter. They're tracking a kelp dial. She wanted to compare notes about the breakwater. The name sighed through the room. Dr. Alara Vos Marina, to those who knew her when she wore pier splinters in her knees and a camera around her neck. She and Ash had once cataloged tide pools like star maps, counting tiny worlds together until the night grew patient around them. She was the story the town kept in its mouth like a seed. She's back, I said, as if declaring whether. Do you need the East Key? The one for the gate at Seawall. He nodded, relieved to have something to hold. If you don't mind. I reached under the counter for the ring where the keys gather like a metal bouquet. His palm brushed mine and the workshop seemed suddenly too small. All our words crowded shoulder to shoulder. Lynn, he said, and I heard the apology he wasn't sure belonged to him. It's about the pier. That's all. Then it's about the town, I said. We all answer to that. Outside, the sky was a long bruise fading to green. The bell buoy clanged, politely distant. I poured the soap into its wooden molds and smoothed the top with the spatula my grandmother once used for cakes. The scent lifted salt rosemary, a quiet promise of sleep. The kind of bar people hold under the hot tap and think of home. Ash stood watching me as if I were a clock about to tell him whether he was late. I remember the first time I came here, he said. You sold me a salt bar and told me not to expect a miracle. I went home and washed my hands like I hadn't done it right my whole life. You were bleeding from a rope burn, I said. A miracle would have stung. He laughed, and it warmed the room. I'll make it up to you, he added, softer. Dinner at Harlow's, when we're past the worst of it. Or we can just sit here and listen to the pots think. Bring the mug back, I said. We'll call it even. He kissed the top of my head, then the place near my ear where I keep the Tide Times. He smelled like diesel and rain, and a little like the lemons I had sliced an hour ago. The bell chimed as he left. The door turned him into a shape the street could carry. I wrote another line in the margin. He is a good man. Good men can still look at old constellations. At 7:41 p.m., the bay exhaled. The water slipped away from the bold rocks and the thin ones, exposing a risky path children take in summer when they want to scare their parents. I took my coat and went out, because it's a superstition of mine. You attend the lowest tide with a quiet heart, or the sea will think you don't care. Down on the flats, I folded my letter into the old bottle I keep under the steps. The letter wasn't long. See, keep his anchor steady, and if you can't, teach me how to sleep anyway. A small figure was already there at the end of the breakwater. Narrow against the blue, a woman in a weatherproof hood with a notebook at her hip, watching the kelp gleam like wet hair. I knew her by the way the wind parted for her. Some people are doors, and the world opens when they approach. Ash reached her first. I saw it plain, the lift in his step, the kind of light he gets when a problem knocks, and he knows how to shake its hand. He said her name and the gulls went briefly quiet. I could have called his, could have waved. Instead, I listened to the sound a heart makes when it avoids tearing by tearing a little. The tide line drew itself at 7:42 p.m., a blue pencil across the bay. I marked it in my book with the stub I keep behind my ear. Confirmed? The words steadied me. I walked home with sea salt on my lips that wasn't all from the wind. Back in the workshop, the molds had skinned over, smooth as sleep. I pressed my thumb into a corner for luck and left the lights low. When I climbed the stairs, the house breathed like an animal that wants to be kind. In the bedroom, his mug sat on the windowsill, ringed with tea the color of afternoon. I lifted it and felt the weight of the missing. I set the mug by the sink, wrote the label for tomorrow's batch low Tide rosemary for hands that did their best, and put my pencil down. The sea can keep 100 secrets and return one each day. Tonight it returned a small one, my name, unsaid, folding back into the waves as if it had learned to swim. I lay down with the window cracked and let the town's soft noises count for me, the buoy, the heel scrapes of late walkers, the bell that rings when no one touches it because metal remembers. I didn't know then that the storm would come sooner, or that the East Pier would groan before dawn, or that by the time the cranes calmed, Ash would be learning a new language for an old constellation. For now, I slept. The sea, too, pretended to. The next morning, the sky hung low like damp linen. I woke to the sound of ropes creaking at the dock and the muted cough of engines leaving for the first run. The air smelled of diesel and brine, our town's cologne. Ash's side of the bed was cold. Not the kind of cold that says gone, but the kind that says he left before dawn, thinking I'd sleep through it. He never could lie to me, not in words. But silence is another language men learn too well. Downstairs, I lit the small stove and filled the kettle. The soap molds were ready. When I lifted the wooden frame, the surface gave a soft sea salt and rosemary settling into form. I always loved this part, the first cut. Like parting water, like proof that something shapeless decided to stay. The phone buzzed once on the counter. A message from Marina Voss. Morning, Lynn. Could you tell Ash that the title logs from your side were perfect? We'll need them again this week. Hope you're keeping dry. I stared at it a long while before typing, sure. Stay safe out there. Then deleted the draft and put the phone face down. The shop opened at 9. Mrs. Harrow was the first in, smelling of peppermint and concern. Storm coming early, she said. Radio says by tonight. You got shutters that hold. I've got old bones that bend, I told her. They'll hold together. She laughed, dropped coins in the jar, and asked if the fisherman's bar batch was done. When she left, I stood by the window, watching the harbor cloud over. The gulls flew lower, the kind of flight that says even they don't trust what's coming. At 11, the bell rang again. I looked up, expecting another customer, but it was her. Marina Voss looked exactly the way a tide does when it forgets to apologize. Wind-cut hair, a jacket stained with seawater maps, a notebook tucked under her arm like a secret. "Hi," she said, as if she'd never left this town, or the man who once measured his seasons by her departures. "Ash told me you're the one keeping the barometers alive." I thought I'd dropped the new readings. I nodded. "He's at the site, East Pier. They'll be testing the barriers before noon." She placed a waterproof envelope on the counter, then glanced at the rows of soaps. "You still use rosemary," she said softly. "I remember you writing about it once. Something about its memory." I cut her off with a polite smile. "It's good for wounds." For a moment, the shop held its breath. The smell of salt water and oil filled the quiet between us. She was beautiful in that restless way, like weather that refuses to settle. I understood why Ash once followed her across 3 coastlines. "I didn't mean to," she started, but I raised a hand. "You didn't." She hesitated, then nodded, as if grateful I spared her the confession. "I'll be around the harbor for the next few weeks," she said. "Maybe I'll see you both." When the bell rang behind her, the air seemed to rush back in, as if it had been waiting for permission to breathe. I turned to the window. Out there, on the far pier, 2 small figures moved between cranes and ropes, Ash and the crew. Even from this distance, I could tell his stance from anyone else's. He carried his weight like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. By dusk, the storm rolled in fast. The horizon swallowed itself. Clouds pressed down until the sea went pure. I locked the shutters, moved the finished bars to higher shelves, and filled a basin with fresh water, storm habits older than faith. Then the phone buzzed again. "Pier breach. Containment gates jammed. Ash still out there. Don't come down, Marina." I didn't think. I grabbed my coat, flashlight, and the old bottle that used to hold my letters. I ran. The wind met me halfway down the cliff path, wet and angry. Waves slapped the rocks, breaking themselves to be heard. At the pier, the cranes screamed metal. Lights blinked red through the rain. Men shouted over the roar. And there he was, Zosh, harnessed, soaked, shouting orders, trying to unjam a winch, while Marina steadied the line beside him. For a heartbeat, everything inside me blurred. The scene looked almost holy, the 2 of them against the storm, framed by white spray and lightning's brief applause. A beam snapped, the sound like bone. Marina slipped, rope flying from her hands. Ash lunged, caught her arm, and hauled her back, his voice lost in the thunder. The sea took that moment to swallow my own voice whole. I could have called his name, but the word wouldn't rise. It stuck, salt and grief and something heavier. When the sirens from the Coast Guard cut through the rain, I turned and walked back up the hill. My shoes filled with water, the bottle in my coat knocked against my ribs like a second heart. At the door, I stopped, dripping. I pulled the cork from the bottle and poured it into the sink. The letter inside was blank this time. Maybe the sea had already read it. Later, when the lights flickered back, I wrote one line in my ledger. "Promises kept by the sea always cost something human." Then I washed my hands with the last bar of rosemary salt soap. It smelled faintly of endings, clean, quiet, inevitable. I slept to the sound of rain arguing with the roof, and I dreamed of the tide counting names it could not return. The storm left before dawn, but it didn't really go, only crouched beyond the horizon, breathing. I could feel it in my wrists, that faint pull the way weather leaves a fingerprint on the bones. By morning, the town smelled of tin and seaweed. The gulls were back to their arguments, the kind of noise that pretends everything survived. I boiled water, set the kettle beside the window, and waited for the harbor siren, the single long note that means safe enough. At 9, the bell over the shop door rang. I thought it would be Mrs. Harrow again, come to gossip about roofs. But it was Ash. He looked like the sea had kept him overnight, hair plastered to his forehead, eyes blood red from wind and no sleep. His jacket still dripping. "Don't," I said. before he could start. You'll ruin the floor. He smiled faintly. I already ruined everything else. I handed him a towel anyway. You're late for your apology. I came as soon as they cleared the site. He sank into the chair by the counter, the same one where he used to fall asleep while I labeled soap bars. No one was hurt. Marina's fine. I said. His head jerked up. You'd want the hill, I cut in. You pulled her back. I was there. He opened his mouth, closed it, then found some version of the truth that didn't taste too sharp. It wasn't what it looked like. That's the oldest sentence in every storm, I said quietly. And the most useless. He rubbed a hand over his face, salt leaving a pale film on his skin. You shouldn't have been near the cliffs. You shouldn't have made me need to be. The kettle clicked off. I poured 2 mugs, one plain, one with the blue chip on the handle. He watched the steam rise between us like a fragile wall. I thought about you all night, he said. Every time the wind hit, I kept thinking if the shop's still standing, if she's still awake, if she hates me yet. I don't hate you, I said. Hate requires more energy than I have left. He reached for the mug, then hesitated. Marina wanted to thank you. She said the data from your logs saved hours. I'm sure she said it better. That made him flinch. He took a slow breath. We talked after, about the work, about everything. I didn't move, and she's leaving again. Back to the institute in Bergen. Good. The sea can miss her properly that way. He leaned forward, elbows on knees. Lynn, look at me. I didn't. The tide's still out. Please? I met his eyes, then the color of deep harbor water before a squall. I know what you're trying to say, I whispered. You want to reassure me you didn't choose her. But the truth is, Ash, you thought about it. And that's enough to sink a small boat like mine. He looked like a man being measured for loss. I can't fix that. No, I said, but you can stop pretending it's weather. It was choice. Outside, a rope snapped somewhere sharp final. He turned toward the sound, but I didn't. I'm scheduled to help with the rebuild, he said. 2 weeks, maybe 3. After that, you'll be tired, I said softly. And you'll want quiet. That's what people want when they realize something broke. He stood, towel forgotten on the chair. You're not even going to try. I already did, I said. Every night you were late, every storm I waded through, every time your voice said just a meeting. That was me trying. He didn't argue. Maybe because he finally understood that forgiveness is a tide to hit leaves when it's done explaining itself. At the door, he paused. You said once, the sea writes back. What did it say this time? I looked past him, toward the pale strip of horizon returning to light. It said there's more than one kind of drowning. He nodded, and the bell gave its small metallic sigh as he left. When I closed the door, the quiet folded around me, again gentle, heavy, real. I took my ledger from the shelf and wrote 1 sentence. The storm always breaks twice, once inside. Then I washed the mugs, left his on the sill where the light could dry it, and went upstairs to rest. The sea, below, kept its breathy. The week after the storm, the town moved as if walking through half-dry paint. Everything was slower, stickier, softer. The gulls perched instead of screaming, and the fishermen spoke in sentences that ended before they should. Ash didn't come by again. I didn't expect him to. There's a rhythm to disappointment. You stop checking the doorbell, then stop noticing silence, and finally start enjoying it. I filled my days with work. Tourists hadn't yet returned, but locals always needed soap. There's something about hardship that makes people want to feel clean. Each morning I wrote a new line in my ledger. Not poetry, exactly. More like breath marks. Tuesday, salt heavier than usual. Wednesday, found my name etched faintly on the fogged glass. Thursday, the sea keeps secrets the same way people keep photographs too long. On Friday, a postcard slipped under the door. No address, no return mark. Just a photograph of the East Pier at sunrise newly rebuilt. Cranes standing still as prayer. On the back, in block letters, almost done. Hope you're sleeping. I traced the ink with my thumb. The card was damp around the edges, the way paper gets when someone writes and hesitates over each word. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house felt too awake, the air tasting faintly of storms that didn't happen. I sat by the window, watching moonlight break itself into pieces across the bay. Somewhere out there, the East Pier blinked with new light, steadier, safer. It made me think of the first letter I ever wrote to the sea. I was 15, and angry at everything. I threw a note into the surf that said, "Take what hurts and keep it." The next morning, a jellyfish washed up right where I'd stood. I decided that meant it hurt me, but couldn't promise to do better. So I started writing every time I didn't know how to speak to people. The bottles became my confessions, and the tide, my patient listener. Now though, I hadn't sent one since that night. The bottles waited in their crate like unsent apologies. At midnight, I lit a candle and opened my ledger again. The blue pencil trembled a little. Too much coffee, or too much heart. I wrote, "Low tide tonight, 12:14. Maybe one more letter." Outside, the air held its breath. I put on my coat, took one of the bottles, and walked down the cliff path. The stones were slick but familiar. Even darkness has muscle memory. When I reached the flats, the moon hung low and yellow, the color of ash before it cools. I knelt, uncorked the bottle, and began to write on the folded note inside. "See, he says he's rebuilding what broke, but we both know some structures collapse exactly where they must. If you see him out there, tell him I kept his mug. Tell him I learned to sleep without counting tides. Tell him not all storms are warnings, some are reminders." I slipped the note back in, pressed the cork, and set it adrift. The current took it like a sigh. When I turned to leave, I saw a figure at the far end of the shore. A man, standing still, coat whipping. Even without the moonlight, I would have known the shape. Ash. He didn't call. Neither did I. Between us was a stretch of wet sand, scattered with reflections that looked like stars fallen out of place. He raised a hand, not a wave, not a plea, just an acknowledgement. I nodded once, the kind you give when both of you know the moment can't survive speech. Then he walked the other way, toward the pier, and I toward the cliff. The sea decided where to keep each of us. When I got home, the candle had burned low. The wax pooled like a map of some coastline I'd never visit. I closed the ledger and wrote one last line on its cover. "The sea never mails back, but it always answers." I slept with salt still on my palms. Somewhere in the dark, a bottle floated between us, carrying words neither of us would claim again. 3 days passed before I saw him again. Not in person, only in the newspaper folded beside my morning tea. Local engineer honored for rebuilding East Pier. There he was, photographed beneath a pale banner, hair still unruly, smile small and tired. In the corner of the picture stood Marina, her expression calm, detached, already belonging somewhere else. I folded the page without reading the rest. Newsprint always left a smudge on my fingers. This time it looked like a bruise. Outside, the bay glittered, like someone had spilled a handful of coins. The sea looked deceptively kind, the way people look when they've just remembered your name but won't say it aloud. That afternoon, a courier delivered a box wrapped in brown paper. Inside the mug, the same chipped blue one he'd left on my windowsill. Clean, dry, heavier somehow. Beneath it lay a short note written in his blunt handwriting. "For your tea. The pier's finished. I hope you sleep better now, Ash." I traced the rim of the mug. There was a tiny crack near the handle, one that hadn't been there before. Storm damage, maybe, or just proof that even what returns, changes. I made tea anyway, rosemary and salt, my odd little ritual, and carried it down to the rocks. The tide was on its way in, pushing softly, almost apologetic. Sometimes, after big storms, the sea gives back what it took. Half-buried shells, lost ropes, glass worn smooth as candy. That day it offered something small, but deliberate, a fragment of green glass, almost circular, edges polished by patience. It looked exactly like the neck of a bottle. I turned it over in my hand, tracing the curve that once held a cork. Maybe it was one of mine. Maybe it wasn't. The sea never labels its returns. I pocketed the glass and stayed there until the light thinned. The horizon was stitched with gold threads of sunset, and for a moment it was easy to believe that forgiveness might look like this: soft, ordinary, endless. But forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. It's just the quiet after the loud. When I came back home, I placed the mug on the shelf beside my ledgers, then the glass fragment next to it. One thing given, one thing returned. That seemed fair. Later that night, I wrote in the ledger again. The sea keeps its accounts better than I do. Then, because some habits are slower to fade than others, I opened a new page and began a letter not to the sea this time, but to him. Ash, you once said cranes don't think. They just move until someone stops them. I think people are the same. You moved until I stopped being part of your map. That's not blame, it's just cartography. I hope your new shores are kind. I didn't bottle this one. I left it folded between the ledger pages. A dry letter for a wet world. Before bed, I stepped outside once more. The wind was mild, carrying the faint temps of seaweed and night-blooming jasmine. Down by the pier, a single light glowed, a worker's lamp, maybe, or someone arriving too late to leave. For the first time in months, I didn't wonder which. The mug cooled by my bedside. The sea whispered its endless arithmetic outside the window. And I slept, not deeply, but without dreams. Sometimes that's enough. There is a place at the far edge of the cove where no one goes. The cliffs there crumble into chalk dust, and the water sounds different, hollow, as if echoing someone else's tide. When I was younger, I used to think it was where the sea slept. Now I know it's where it remembers. A week after the mug arrived, I walked there for the first time in years. The weather had turned patient again. Clouds folded neatly, air thin and clean. I carried nothing but my small notebook, and the glass fragment in my pocket. Halfway down the trail, I saw a figure by the rocks. For a heartbeat, I thought it was him. But it was only an old fisherman repairing his nets. He nodded once, the way island people greet quietly, respectfully, like not to disturb the wind. Low tide's pulling out strong today, he said. It'll show you what it's been hiding. I smiled, thanked him, and kept walking. When I reached the shallows, the waterline had receded far enough to uncover a patch of dark sand and twisted seaweed. And there, half buried, were the bottles. Not just one or two, some cracked, some clouded, some still sealed with their tiny corks. My bottles. My handwriting, faint through the glass, softened by years of salt. The sea hadn't taken them away. It had kept them, tucked here like secrets too tender to throw back. I crouched, picked one up. The note inside was blurred but legible enough to read a few words. Come back safe. Another bottle held a scrap of sea map, a sketch of the pier before it ever broke. One still had a tiny pressed sprig of rosemary. I laughed then, quietly. It wasn't joy, it was recognition. The sea had been my confessional, but it had never been my confessor. It just listened, stored, waited for me to return. When I looked up, the tide was beginning to turn. Water crept in slow fingers, curling around the bottles as if checking their names. I understood. It wasn't trying to drown them again. It was tucking them back to sleep. I knelt and whispered, "Thank you for keeping them safe." And maybe because the world loves a small mercy, a wave lifted one bottle toward me before retreating. I caught it easily. It was lighter than I remembered. Inside, the paper was folded tight, the ink pale but visible. I didn't recognize the words at first. Then I saw the signature. Ash's handwriting. I sat on the wet sand, heart steady but heavy, and read, "Lynn, if the sea ever shows you this, it means you came back. I don't know if I deserve that kind of miracle. I'm sorry for the things I built and broke. You once told me water keeps shape only in memory. Maybe love does too. If you ever forgive me, let it be quiet. I'll hear it anyway." I folded the note again, pressed it against my palm. The paper was soft as skin. I didn't cry. Tears are too loud for places like this. I just breathed, slow and even, letting the salt air fill the cracks words couldn't. When I stood, the tide had reached my ankles. I placed the bottle back among the others. "Rest now," I said, though I wasn't sure if I meant the sea or my own heart. By the time I climbed the trail, the water had already covered them again, smooth and shining as if they'd never existed. At home, I dried my hands and wrote in the ledger. The sea never forgets, it simply waits until forgetting looks like forgiveness. Then I blew out the lamp, and for the first time, the silence didn't ache, it hummed. Like the pause after a long, honest song. The next mornings were made of pale gold and quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't ache anymore, only hum steady alive, full of tiny movements you don't notice until the grief is gone. I started opening the shop earlier, lighting the lamps while the gulls still argued above the rooftops. People came again. Teachers buying soap for the school sinks, sailors bringing shells to trade for salt bars, children pressing their noses to the glass to watch the bubbles rise in their jars. I smiled easily now. My voice no longer caught on the word waiting. Sometimes, when the tide was low, I would walk the shoreline with my notebook. Not to write letters anymore, but to take notes on the color of the day. Pale mint sea, warm gray sky, quiet blue courage. Ash didn't return. He sent no more notes, no more couriers, no phone calls. The town said he'd taken a new contract north offshore turbines, long hours, cold winds. It sounded like him, always rebuilding something far away. And yet, some evenings, I still thought I heard his boots on the path. Not in longing, just in memory's echo, that small polite ghost that refuses to leave completely. I didn't chase it anymore. One night, near midsummer, a letter arrived. No return address, only my name written in that same blunt hand. Inside, a single photograph. The East Pier at dusk. Calm sea, rebuilt cranes, the horizon violet with the first stars. And at the very edge of the frame my bottles. Half buried, half lit by the fading sun. On the back, just one sentence. They're still there. So am I. No signature this time. He didn't need one. I placed the photograph between the ledger's last pages, and closed the cover. Some stories don't end, they rest. That night I brewed rosemary tea in the chipped blue mug, carried it outside, and sat on the porch while the tide whispered below. The stars were clear enough to count. See, I said softly, thank you for keeping us honest. A small wave touched the rocks in answer. Maybe coincidence, maybe grace. I thought of the letters sleeping beneath the cove. The one he wrote, the one I never sent, the thousands the world never needs to read. They were all still there, part of the ocean's long memory, steady and salt-sweet. I took a sip, smiled, and finally felt what forgiveness really is. Not forgetting, not returning, just peace, the kind that doesn't need to be shared to be real. The night grew quieter still. Somewhere out there, a buoy rang once, and then the world folded itself into calm. Summer slipped in without asking. The town smelled of salt, lemons, and paint. Fishermen were mending nets barefoot on the docks. Children ran between the gulls, and the days stretched long enough to forget where one ended. I kept working. Orders piled up. Tourists discovered the shop through word of mouth. Some bought soap just to talk, to hear about the woman who writes to the sea. They'd smile like it was a legend. I didn't correct them, because maybe every story begins as a confession and ends as folklore. One morning I opened the mailbox and found a small package wrapped in weatherproof canvas. No return address again. Inside was a handful of seashells, tiny, pale, curved like Kama sand, a note written in pencil on waterproof paper. North winds colder than memory. Thought you'd like the sound these make? It wasn't signed, but I didn't need to see his name. The handwriting itself had a rhythm I could recognize in sleep. I held one shell to my ear. The sea's hum was faint, slower, softer, not roaring, just breathing. I placed the shells in a glass bowl by the counter. When customers asked where they were from, I said, from a friend who listens to weather for a living. It made them laugh. It made me feel less alone. In the evenings, after closing, I'd sit by the pier with my tea. The rebuilt cranes gleamed like constellations drawn by human hands, steady mechanical stars. Sometimes I imagined him there, somewhere past the horizon, working under the same slow sunset, both of us keeping to our promises in different latitudes. The tide that night was gentle, lapping at the pilings like a heartbeat. I took my notebook and wrote a single line. Some things stay, not because they're anchored, but because they know where to return. I didn't throw this one into the sea. I left it tucked beneath a piece of driftwood, where the wind could decide what to do with it. When I stood to go, A group of kids ran past me, chasing a stray balloon down the beach. One of them called back, "Miss Lynn?" "The tide's coming in," I smiled. "It always does." Back home, the house smelled of soap and rosemary. The mug waited by the window. The green glass caught the evening light like a tiny sun. I turned off the lamps and watched the first stars bloom over the bay. Somewhere far north, a man might be standing on another pier, holding a shell to his ear, hearing the same breath of water that touched my shore. Maybe that's what love becomes when it's done breaking. A rhythm shared by two coasts, a tide that never left. Autumn came quietly, as if walking barefoot. The mornings grew crisp, the salt sharper in the air. The sea changed color deeper now, less forgiving, like it had been thinking too much. It was around then that the lighthouse keeper, old Mr. Doran, came by the shop. He leaned his weight on the counter, smelled of rust and wind. "Light needs new glass," he said. "Storm cracked it again. You still keep that polish recipe your grandmother swore by?" I smiled. "The one with olive oil and sea salt." "Always," he nodded. "Good. I'll send someone to fetch it. Maybe the new guy will learn something." "The new guy? Ashpay?" he said. "They transferred him from the pier maintenance crew. Seems he asked for it." The kettle behind me started to whistle. For a moment, all I heard was the shrill note, the rush of blood, the old ache stretching like a tide that refused to recede. "He's at the lighthouse?" I asked. Doran nodded. "Helps with the night calibrations. You two know each other." "We used to share weather," I said, and poured the water to hide my hands, shaking. He chuckled. "Well, he's quiet, but good with the wiring. Seems the sea still wants him close." After he left, the shop felt too still. The clock ticked louder. Even the drying rack creaked like a heartbeat. I set the kettle aside and stared at the steam until it faded. That evening, I walked to the bluff where you could see the lighthouse. Its beams swept across the bay, clean and patient, cutting a path through mist. Every rotation felt like a pulse. I told myself I wouldn't go closer. But tides are stubborn. So are hearts. By dusk the next day, I found myself on the narrow road winding down to the lighthouse. The air smelled of wet rope and diesel. The door was open, light spilling onto the steps. He stood inside, sleeves rolled, hair a little longer, same quiet focus. When he saw me, surprise softened into something unreadable, neither joy nor regret, but recognition, like seeing your reflection after a long illness. "Lynn," he said simply. "Ash." The silence that followed was vast enough to hold every letter we never sent. "I heard you took the post," I said. He nodded. "Thought I'd stay somewhere that listens." I smiled faintly. "You always did trust the sea more than people." He wiped his hands on a rag. "It keeps better promises." I wanted to argue, but the waves outside beat me to it. Their rhythm was calm now, unhurried, like breathing. "I didn't come for anything," I said finally. "Just wanted to see the light from closer." He nodded again, eyes tracing the glow through the glass. "It's clearer now. We replaced the cracked lens last week. With new glass." He turned to me, and in his hands was the replacement pane smooth, faintly green at the edges. The color of the bottle fragment I'd kept. "I found this near the cove," he said softly. "Washed up with the old ropes. Thought it looked familiar." My breath caught. "You kept it?" He smiled barely. "The tide gave it to me." I figured it wasn't done telling its story. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The sea roared below, steady and endless. "I read your note," I said at last. "The one in the bottle." He nodded. "Then you know." "I do." I looked toward the beam, slicing through fog, returning every few seconds like a heartbeat. "And I forgave you long before I found it." He didn't answer, but his shoulders eased like a man who'd been waiting for permission to breathe. We stood there, watching the light sweep out toward the horizon. Each turn of its glow washed over our faces, erasing and rewriting us in the same motion. When I finally stepped back toward the door, he said quietly, "The tide's lowest tomorrow night. You'll want to see it. The reef shows itself only once a year." I met his gaze. "Maybe I will." Outside, the air was cool, and the sea was calm enough to sound like sleep. I walked home with salt on my lips that wasn't from tears, and when I reached the house, I wrote one last line in my ledger. Even the last low tide is just the start of another moon. It was the lowest tide of the year, so low that even the oldest rocks remembered air. The town gathered by the cliffs, lanterns glowing like captured stars. Children pointed at the exposed reefs, lovers took photographs, and somewhere behind them, the sea waited, patient as a wound. I walked alone, notebook in hand. The air smelled of wet stone and something older, something close to forgiveness. Down by the cove, the sand stretched farther than I'd ever seen, revealing shapes I'd only guessed before, carved channels, small pools catching pieces of moonlight. And there, in the center of it all, stood the lighthouse, its beam sweeping slowly, steady and kind. I didn't expect to see him, but when I looked toward the edge of the pier, he was already there. Ash stood barefoot in the shallows, jeans rolled, flashlight hooked to his belt. He looked up when I approached, that same careful half smile, the one that doesn't ask, doesn't explain. "You came," he said. "You said the reef shows itself only once a year," I replied. "I wanted to see what the sea keeps hidden." He nodded toward the water. "It's quieter tonight. Almost gentle, it knows we're leaving it alone." We walked together, following the edge of the exposed reef. The air was cool. The sea was whispering things only the moon could hear. Every step made a sound like paper tearing slowly. At one point, he stopped. The beam from the lighthouse passed over us, white and clean, and I saw at the crack in the green glass he'd used to mend the lens. "My glass, does it hold?" I asked. He looked at it, then at me. "It does. A little imperfection makes the light softer," I smiled. "Then we did something right." He laughed quietly, but it carried far. "You always find a way to make broken things sound holy." Maybe because they are. For a moment the world shrank to just us, the sound of the sea, and the thin hush between waves. "I'm leaving soon," he said finally. "Permanent assignment, northern route, long-term maintenance." I nodded. "You've always belonged to the water." "And you?" "I belong to the shore," I said. "Someone has to keep the letters." The tide had started to return, slowly, quietly. The pools filled, swallowing our reflections bit by bit. He reached into his pocket and handed me something small, another bottle. Empty, corked, perfectly clear. "For when you write again," he said. "Even if you never throw it." I took it, fingers brushing his. "And if I do, then I'll know you're still talking to the sea." A gust of wind moved between us, bringing the salt, the light, the inevitable distance. When the tide touched our feet, I said, "Goodbye, Ash." He hesitated. Then, "Good night, Lynn." Not farewell, not forever, just a kind of peace. He walked toward the lighthouse. I watched until the beam swept past him, turned him into shadow, then light again, and then only the sound of waves. I stayed until the moon slid behind the clouds, and the tide erased every footprint between us. At dawn, I went home, placed the empty bottle on the windowsill beside the cracked mug and green glass. The three of them caught the morning light like a small, quiet trinity of things once lost, now at rest. I opened my ledger to its last page and wrote, "When the moon forgets the tide, the sea remembers for both of them." Then I closed the book. The sea outside was rising again, steady, endless, alive. And I knew, love, like the tide, never truly leaves. It just learns a gentler way to return.